I think when I reflect back on the podcast, today's episode is one of the most honest, emotional and raw conversations I've ever had with a guest. Today we're going to tackle a difficult conversation around trauma caused by child sexual abuse. I'm Simon Osimo and I want to welcome you to the Who I Became podcast. Now I'm joined today by Dr. Raj, who is Professor of Criminal Justice at Metropolitan State University, nationally known for his work on bias. He's a victim of sexual abuse as a child and a dear friend of mine. I have to say this conversation is not for the faint-hearted, with Raj sharing his experiences as a victim of sexual abuse which led to a suicide attempt. But you'll hear his recovery, transformation and how he has forgiveness for his abusers. But before we dive into today's content, if you haven't already, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the podcast to be notified of all the future episodes, and it really helps us grow when you like and share. And if you want to watch the video of today's interview, head on over to YouTube where you can watch this and all my other episodes on my channel at Simon Osimo. Now Raj is a great man and a dear friend, so I'm so proud of him for being vulnerable and sharing his story with you today. Now will you join me as we dive into this week's conversation with Dr. Raj in one entitled Overcoming Childhood Trauma. Well, Dr. Raj, welcome to the Who I Became podcast.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
Well, I know we've been friends for a little while now, and we've had some very interesting conversations, me and you, before on some very deep subjects.
Yeah, interesting. The term interesting is right in Minnesota. If you use it, people are like, okay, you're trying to be indifferent. But I think our conversations have been kind of deep.
Yeah, well, and I can't remember if we recorded it. 2020, must have been 2019, me and you shot a 3-part series on implicit bias, racial bias and cultural bias. And little did we know that Minnesota was going to become the world focus on those with George Floyd and stuff. So let's see where this one goes. It'll be an interesting podcast. So maybe let's start off a little bit about, I was looking at your bio online, and there's things that I saw I didn't know, but you teach restorative justice and diversity at Metropolitan State University. You specialise in unpacking implicit bias, and we might not have enough time to get too deep into that. But that is a very topical subject right now. And you've got about 20 years of community-based activism as a researcher and educator, and you also describe yourself as a recovering criminologist. So that stuff that I got from your bio, Raj, maybe dissect your bio and tell the audience a bit about who you are.
I came to that term after entering academia, especially at Metro, where we have a lot of reference to ourselves as faculty, as experts. And I've always shied away from using terms like expert. Yeah. Right? What makes one an expert, right? Just because he or she or they have research background, do they have lived experience? Does that mean you have published a lot on this? So as I was kind of gathering my thoughts on it, I've been in the streets a lot, working with communities, right? With NAACP, with Root and Restore, police reform work in St. Paul. And many of these places took me down to the trenches. And in the trenches, you are nobody. Right? You're just part and parcel of the people who walk alongside or searching in search of justice. So, and Richard Pryor once said, right? He said, hey, I came here looking for justice, but when I got here, it's just us. And I'm like, whoa, wait. What's that wisdom about? And realize that, my God, we are all in search of this process as opposed to being an expert. So academia has a way to kind of give you this false sense of superiority and muscle to think that you have arrived. But for me, I realized, my God, everything I've learned in textbooks and in research does not play out in a sanitized way. It's messy. So that's why the reference to being a recovering criminologist kind of walk away from academia and come into the thick of things in the trenches.
Yeah, and I know you've been
Yeah.
a sort of activist for 20 years, sort of researcher and educator,
Yeah.
but I mean, what I love about you is you're quite a cool dude. If anyone's watching the video of this podcast, they'll see that, you're like a trendy black guy, and not, when I have a stereotype of a professor in my mind, you don't really come in there. So, I mean, how did you get into academia then? When did you sort of become a professor and get your PhD and stuff?
It was a struggle. I mean, I was, I'm a recovering alcoholic and a drug addict. I was into a lot of that as I was pursuing my degrees, and an undergraduate degree in sociology didn't mean anything to me. I just wanted to get this degree and move on to a career. And as I got deeper into that particular study and began to understand the race relations in Louisiana, right? I was in Louisiana pursuing. And North Louisiana, especially, I mean, oh my God, you talk about religion infused with racism, right? They are just hand in hand, they're wedded together. And in this process, you realize how ostracized you are as a result of all of that deep-rooted history, traditions, rituals, ceremonies, right? So it's that began to drive me in this direction of like, what is going on, right? And then pursuing a degree in counseling with a master's in counseling also led me to the same place where people are in pain. It's not this surface level wound and frustration that leads to people having a difficult relationship in the community. There's something deeper. Right, trying to pursue a better understanding of that led me to studying in counseling, but then launched me back into the community and began to work with people who are dealing with pain, right, trauma, people who are dealing with deep racist oppression, and all of that launched me into taking up this study, a PhD program, but meanwhile, the whole time I was in the community working, right, teaching. And so the pathway to academia was not as smooth as many have, like launching from undergraduate to a master's to a PhD. The PhD program especially was driven by a search, right? The sort of Viktor Frankl kind of thing, right? Man's search for meaning.
Mm.
Yeah.
And so, when you look at your sort of journey to become a professor then. Yeah. And I say professor, I guess that's what you got to. That's what you are. So that's what I've got to say. But I mean, how much of your, I know that you battled drug addiction, alcoholism, and also sexual abuse as a child. I mean, how much of that plays into sort of who you are now, and maybe the journey that you've taken? Because you're a strong advocate. I mean, if ever there's a question I have surrounding bias or race relations, you're speed dial 1 in my phone. And I think how much of that ties into your past? Maybe share what you can about those sort of three areas of your life. Yeah,
so the idea of putting that down here, even I never really claimed to reconcile and recognize my sexual abuse as a kid, right? 5, 6 years old, when I was, raped, was molested, right, by neighbors, and not realizing the impact of it until I began to fumble into relationships as an adult. And you're thinking like, why am I having such a difficult time, right? So as a counselor, I recognized all of these connections, right? But I also asked myself, what was deeper in this particular, what were these men are looking for, right? Apart from me, but there was much more damage done to all of us as a collective. So I began to ask myself that deeper question of like historical oppression and why, and the topic of sex and how that has been taught to us and not taught to us in many ways, right? And how it became as a topic that has to be done in the dark versus in the light, right? So had that question boiling, but also that sexual abuse led me to kind of undermining who I am and began to, right, hide behind alcohol and drug addiction because those things numbed all that pain, right? I didn't have to deal with them. And if I couldn't get along, couldn't find a partner, right, I just simply went and drank. So I never, went to parties and went to gatherings, I never drank for the sake of like the social hour, right? There was nothing social about it.
Mm.
It was everything about me getting totally drunk.
To forget. Or
Yes,
to
to forget,
yeah.
right? So these things began to I began to question myself about this. And when I left my job or fired from my job in the Mankato area, right, I began to ask deeper questions about like, okay, how has all these changed me and affected me, and how is this also affecting my relationship with my children, right? Because by that time, my marriage was down the tube, right? Because of that lack of intimacy, and I couldn't figure this out. But I know that my children are important to me. So I began to ask myself those kinds of questions. And those questions also led me to ask bigger questions about what's happening in our society, in our community. Why are there lack of sense of community, lack of thereof relationship with each other, and how does deep-rooted pain and trauma affects us as a community? So all of these things came together as I entered academia, teaching full-time at Metropolitan State University, and began to take on this idea of restorative practices, right? And how do we restore humanity and transform system versus repair and reform, right? Those are all important items, right? Repairing something and reforming something. But I think those things have stranded us in this wanting to fully change who we are and what we are as a system.
Yeah, and you said something which was really interesting. I don't know, maybe you didn't know you'd said it because you delivered the line so much, but my brain went straight there. And you know, this happened when you were sort of 5 or 6, but you mentioned about the men that sexually abused you. When you went on a self-reflection as to what were they going through? I mean, was that a Raj in his 20s or 30s, or was that Raj as a young man? When were you reflecting, thinking, not only why is this happening to me, or I'm the victim of this sexual abuse, but also to be able to outwardly see what are these men seeking? That's very deep. I mean, what age did that sort of occur?
You know, I think it about 10 plus years ago is when I really thought about that particular way of dealing with this pain. Prior to that, it was all anger and frustration. In my early 20s, when I began to have relationship, it's like, what is going on? Why am I not connecting with people at a deeper level? I know I have that ability to do so with friends, but when it comes to intimate relationship, it was absent. It was as if there was a deep black hole there, right? And I'm thinking like, what is going on? And I began to be angry and frustrated about having that happen to me as a young kid, and not having space in a room and an opportunity to process it, right? Even though I was a counselor by the time I was in my 20s, I was doing marriage and family therapy. I was doing individual counseling, but to turn that mirror onto myself was not something that I was ready for, right? So as I got into these deeper relationships, saw my relationship going down the tube, is when I began to ask myself, like, what is it about me that I don't understand, so that if I have a deeper level of understanding, how do I extend that to understand who these people are who abused me, who caused the harm, right? And that, to me, is the pathway to restorative practices. Right? When I began to ask that question of harm and not crime, right? And what caused the harm? What caused the harm to them that made this, what they did, normal in their perspective?
Yeah. As you say that, I told you offline, like interviewed this guy called Lewis Conway over in New York. Fascinating guy, incredible. And very deep background, a lot of transparency, some of things that you just spoken about, but he said something to me about, I think Lewis is in his 50s now, convicted for sort of like a manslaughter murder charge when he was maybe like 19, 20. But he said that it was something that he used to hide behind, but he said it was only when he actually released that the thing that he used to hide was actually what freed him. That's why he went on my podcast and could talk about his incarceration, his transformation since and stuff. I mean, would you? I get a feeling you can mostly relate to what he said. I mean, because you talk very openly about this, but I imagine there was a time when you couldn't talk openly about some of the sexual abuse.
Oh yeah, I mean, for me, honestly, when I think about those incidents, it was always a black hole. It was something that I couldn't recall, but I knew something happened. But it's only in the past 10, 15 years that I've been able to picture what happened. I can picture myself, being raped, right? I can picture that man on top of me, right? I can picture walking out of that space with just feeling dirty and right. Could picture the first time how I was brought into that process of being abused as a 5-year-old, right? And I couldn't picture all of that at that time, prior to, right? When I was able to picture those things and really see those individuals as human beings, right? Yes, they did this harm to me, but I'm also thinking like, okay, I know you as a person who works hard. I know you as a person who I've seen them being charitable to people, right? So something about their own life, their own mess, their own trauma, right? I'm able to now talk about that and free myself of this idea that I am dirty. I brought this onto myself, right? Those perspectives, right? Those kinds of real experiences broke that chain. And am I ready for relationships? I'm not, right? I'm still grappling with all of those things, but I have a better understanding. And whoever I meet these days, I'm just like, this is who I am.
Yeah.
Right. And and you say release. For me, it has transformed the way I show up in my communities. Right. It's transformed the way. And so I'm ready to dig deep with folks and really relate to what they are saying, and then understand the pain at a much at the roots, as opposed to just looking at things at the surface level.
And I know there's many facets to your life, and we we could do maybe talk for 10 hours on this. I don't think this is a very, very deep conversation. But another point I want to sort of try and draw out from you is, as you sit in front of me today, we don't have to say your age, but a very mature man. The black skin hides your age, Raj. I know that. Sure. So, but if we go back to when you were a child, and I was a former investigator in England. I investigated child sex offences before. I mean, they're terrible for the victim, they're terrible for the families, and they're terrible for the prosecutors that have to go through and sort of put all those cases together. But looking at you as a child, is there anything that you take from that as to what advice would you give other children who are in that position? I mean, how do you get to where you are today quicker? Yeah. I mean, how do you try and get through the trauma? Because most of these sexual offences, people won't say that I'm the victim because there's this shame and a lot of things you're feeling. So I guess I'd just love to get your perspective on that, Raj, as to, what would have brought you to the point quicker than what you are now?
Oh, wow.
We might as well just keep this deep, Raj.
No,
let's keep it deep.
No, I will say this. I will say that the culture and the community played a huge role, right? The absence of conversations about sex and in relationships, right? Everything was behind the door, right? When you did something, you realized that it was dirty, right? That's how it was portrayed, right? It was done behind doors as opposed to something that is openly discussed about, and people understand the whole process of living and being a messy human being. That was never brought out, right? You were always expected to be walking on a clean slate, and you make mistakes here and there, but those mistakes, right, are quickly to be corrected. But if you did something here dirty, right, it never should be brought to this clean space, right? So we lived in a society that is always striving to be sanitized, versus reality is always messy. And what I'm asking for us, it's not just a child to do that, but for the community to say, we're a messy space. Let's talk about all of the messiness who we are, that makes up who we are, right? As opposed to trying to do this sort of clean slate work where, oh, sexual abuse is a crime. Your definition of it as a crime and my experience with that are totally different, right? I have to live with this. You can go ahead and punish me and remove me, if you will, right, for the most part, from the society, and then reintroduce me to the society as if things will be done differently, right? What I'm living with is all of that fear and all of that shame and all of that guilt, thinking like, did I deserve this? Did I ask for it? Did I enjoy it? Right? All of those kinds of questions. The only way to respond to those questions is to have a culture and a community that is ready, right? And a system that will integrate that culture and community perspectives versus a system that functions on a sanitized policy and procedure and laws.
Yeah.
That's the only way, I think.
Yeah, and it's very deep. We'll have to keep going on this.
Yeah,
but the other thing that's going through my mind is, I know, a sort of recovering alcoholic, a recovering drug addict, where you are today. What was the maybe the sort of a straw that breaks the camel's back, as we say in England? I don't know if that's an American expression or not, but when was it that you sort of tied your behaviour, perhaps your what could be perceived as negative behaviour? When did you tie that to, I know what is causing this, right? This is the fact that I was a victim of sexual abuse as a child. I've got to seek help. I've got to move through this. Yeah. At what point did you sort of tie those negative behaviours with your sort of release, or you're looking to sort of, forget, or whatever it was for you, Rod?
Well, Simon, it was my attempt to commit suicide, right? That brought me to that point of reflection, that deep reflection. I attempted suicide because I felt like I've lost everything, right? I've lost my children, I've lost the marriage, I've lost the job. I couldn't hold on to anything, it seems like, at some point. And I didn't connect these pieces, right, about that sexual abuse, that alcoholism, combining drugs in it. One was a visible, like by choice, a suicide attempt. The other was me completely drunk and doing, right? I mean, I don't know how many blunts I went through that night, and then driving. I knew at a rational level that I shouldn't do that, but I still drove, right? And when I ended up in a farm, right, I got off the road and ended up in a farm, waking up in the farm, right deep in the mud, and somehow crawling out of the car, getting on the street, and walking at I think it was 3 a.m. That was when I started to reflect: what am I doing? Who am I?
Yeah, and from there, the only thing I can say is that standing in front of me is an incredible guy who I'll say, for the benefit of the listeners, actually records me his interviews in my basement. And I wasn't joking to Raj when I said, but no one ever comes in my house, but Raj is here. So it shows what a good friend he is. And I think your honesty, your transparency, your willingness to share is gonna help other people. I mean, you're an incredible guy, and it's hard for me to know and to hear that you were at such a low place. But I'm glad that you didn't pursue it, and that you're here because there's a lot of good that's come from your life. So maybe let's shift gears and get the smile back on your face. So tell us about some of your sort of advocacy work and your desire to make not just Minneapolis, but the sort of world a closer place about race and sort of reconciliation. Still deep, Raj, but not as deep. Still a deep subject.
I appreciate it. Appreciate your trust and your guidance and your leadership and your friendship in this work. That walk on that highway, right, woke me up to a lot of other things. Right, my relationship with my children mattered. My relationship with my community mattered. And I began to ask myself the questions about what is happening in my community that I have been blind to, right? I have this capacity to do more. And I've done it prior to getting hung up on this addiction, right? And self-pity, right? I began to feel sorry for myself, which is not a bad thing. But when turned that sorriness into suffering, right? As opposed to joining a movement, right? As opposed to struggling, right? So I drew a lot of distinction between those terms. Like when you suffer, you get deeper into your own self. When you struggle, you get into a much more broader, deeper understanding the process. So I now begin to understand the struggle that the civil rights movement was in, as opposed to suffering. They never really described what they were experiencing as a suffering, but always talked about the struggle. And I never really understood it, right? And over the years, I'm like, whoa, wait, right? I'm part of a larger community. I'm standing on all of these shoulders of people who have fought for people like me. What am I doing? Right? So I began to move myself off that suffering lens to a struggle lens. And in struggle, there's always that hope, right? As Dr. King would say, right? The promised land. You're getting there, right? And if you do not personally get there, you're helping others to get there. You're moving the goalposts right closer to that space. So that is what I think for me the movement is about, the struggle is about, right? Today in Minneapolis, when that happened to George Floyd, Brother Floyd, right, it is not a one happening. When I call the governor's office and I say, can you declare a day of mourning? Right, his advisor, she asked me the question. She said, "What do you mean by a day of mourning?" I said, "Do you not recognize that this is coming on the heels of the 100th anniversary of the lynching that took place in Duluth, Minnesota?" And she's like, she's a lawyer, and she's like, "What are you talking? What's the relationship?" I say, "This is another form of lynching right, of putting a knee on somebody's neck and somebody's back and ending their life. And you've done that, right? When that happened in Duluth, Minnesota, 100 years ago, 1919, right? There were 10,000 people who stood in their Sunday best to witness that, because their way of life was being affirmed. White supremacist ideology was being affirmed.
Yeah, and I know in the last series that me and you did about Implicit, and maybe the conversations me and you have, Raj, are too deep. We've got to try and lighten the mood somehow. I don't know we're too deep, guys, but the conversation that we had, the big buzzword, and I know you've used it for a long time, is about narratives, changing people's narratives. And I think that is really something that we're seeing not only in America, but across the world, is how do we change the narratives? And I think your experiences have really shaped your narrative that, you want to fight for the underdog. You want to do the right thing. You're very blessed with the life that you've had in your life. There's a lot of sadness in things that happen to you, but there's also a lot of goodness which have come because there's others that don't have your grit, don't have your determination, and don't have your mindset to actually be able to process some of the things that you've happened. I mean, what do you turn it onto that narratives? I mean, what does a narrative mean? What do we need to improve right now with your experience around sort of bias and sort of reconciliation?
Well, I'll just go back to that, Simon, if you will, indulge me a little bit on this idea of suffering. When I was in that space, right, I never celebrated, recognized who I am. I never really recognized my children. I never recognized what was all the things that are happening, right? The so-called progress that has been made, right? There were progress, right? But none of that mattered when I was in this space, right? When I moved out of that space into this struggle, recognized that, there was this recording of Dr. King where was in the hotel, right? In the motel before being shot, that they were going to bed and they had a pillow fight.
Okay.
Right. These are grown men, right? Having a pillow fight because they were laughing and celebrating each other. They saw their humanity, right? And I go to prisons and work with some, and they celebrate each other. They recognize who they are, right? I come out, I see, Leslie Redmond, our president, youngest NAACP president in the United States of America, right? And who's right here in Minneapolis, right? So there are a lot of points of reflection that I failed at that time that I can see in this struggle. So the struggle is not about a positive or negative, right? It is about the narratives of people. And yes, you see a mixed bag of things. You see the messiness about living. So for me, right, it's not about saving the world more so. It's about, as in a simpler term, what Spike Lee often say, do the right thing, right? And it's not about that, just do the right thing. I want to be more and more anchored in my values, right? And if I am more anchored in my values, how does that show up in my teaching? How does that show up in my work in my community? How is that showing up with my children, right? How is that showing up with my friends, right? And it's all of these things have come to be a part of that struggle. So as I'm doing this work, I'm recognizing that some of the impediments, right, to realizing and living anchored to your values are implicit bias, right? The idea of grow versus heal and go on to wellness, right? Is the idea of punishment versus healing and wellness, right? I mean, the alcohol, the addictions court in Maine, right? There's a court, right? They call it healing to wellness court. So you go to this court and it's people sit in circles, people are recognizing each other's humanity, they're celebrating each other and saying, hey, okay, you're off the wagon, you're back drinking, you're back doing. That's fine. You had like 20 days of sobriety.
Yeah.
how did you celebrate those 20 days of sobriety? And people are like, what are you talking about? I'm an addict. No, I know. But what was that 20 days like? Oh, I had clarity, I had vision, I was hopeful. Let's celebrate that. Let's bring you back into that space, right? Instead of saying, oh, you got to be punished, right? It's that this implicit biases that we have about communities, right? That live a certain way, that live in certain zip codes, right? And those biases have continuously informed how we show up, right? In the wake of this pandemic, we're realizing that a lot of medical practices have been informed by biases that have left so many people of color, Black and brown communities, behind, and they're dying, right, as a result of this pandemic. So the power of implicit bias has to be brought forth. We don't recognize the biases that we are carrying and the dissonance those biases have with our values, right? Unless we bring it back to our values, right? Those dissonance will continuously affect you and your own growth and my wellness, and the community's wellness is affected. So that's part of this work. It's about bringing all that back.
And so when I hear all that, and knowing your background, I've been reflecting as you've been talking. Maybe I'm a man that can multitask, but I listen to my brain is taking me off in different directions. I'm thinking this is a podcast that people are going to share with their friends that have got struggles, be it addiction, or someone's disclosing that having suicidal thoughts. I mean, for you, Raj, what are some of the things that you would want to share with someone? If I'm going to share this with a friend and they're going to watch this interview back, and seeing where you were, and now understanding that you are a professor of criminal justice, and you are nationally known for a lot of your work on bias, and you've really dragged your life back in an upward trajectory. What would you want to share?
I want to share this intimacy, right? This type of conversations, be intentional about finding friends, sitting in circles, right? Talking to people, understanding that we are all part of a struggle versus we are going to be stranded in suffering, right? We are part of a struggle. We are part of a larger narrative of what is happening in our communities. And we recognize that systems are bound to walking and being in lanes. And in order for us to affect change, we have to break those lanes up, right? And if we don't break those lanes, we're just going to continue to repeat the same mistakes and the same history, right? So for me, inviting people to say, sit down, talk to other people, be intentional about building relationship, deeper relationship, not the number of friends you have, right? Facebook talks about the number of friends you have versus how deep is your relationship. And that depth is important, right? I may have limited number of friends, but I have deep friends, right? People who will call me, who will think about me, right? I have text messages. People say, I've been thinking about you, right? That is a different type of a relationship versus like, you come and go, right? So I will say that. I will also say, systems and communities have to begin to have an open culture, a culture that allows for our deep, sort of difficult issues to be brought forth, right? If I'm dealing with a lot of frustration and anger and fear, and if it shows up in a way where I'm hating you, right? Why am I hating you, right? I mean, and people are able to harness that fear and that hate and rise to power, right? I don't want to talk about politics, but that's right.
That's a different podcast. Yeah.
As part and parcel that launches people into a position of power, right? And they become charismatic leaders and others, right? And I want our community to recognize that. I want our communities to recognize the pain of living in a culture that has a lot of things that are shaded, that is sort of put away in closets that is still there, right? And to own that. I would say to the people, I say, be willing to talk about your emotional well-being, right? Your physical well-being, your spiritual well-being, your mental well-being, right? If we don't talk about those chambers, as the Native community would say, right, we will tend to repeat this, right? I was unwilling to open up my emotional, my mental health well-being. You put me in a physical well-being, I'll go, right? Work out. You put me in a spiritual well-being, I can talk about them, but I never really experienced it. So those are some of the things that I would say, open those 4 sort of quarters of your life, right? Because those 4 sort of aspects make up our humanity. Let's rise to that.
Yeah, and Dr. Raj, it's been an honor and a privilege to talk to you today, and also I thank you for your openness and transparency in sharing your journey. I really believe that we learn through the experiences of others. Yeah. And I think just other people listening to this podcast, like I said, the reason I wanted you to really summarize some of that is I know someone's going to listen to this podcast and saying, I've got a friend that needs to hear this. I've got someone in my family that needs to hear it. So I think it's great insight that you've shared. So thank you for joining me.
Oh, Simon, I appreciate it. And I also want to just say to the viewers, right, if there's anybody viewing,
if there's anyone viewing, I've got to pick up on that here, Raj. I'm a former investigator and trained to interview. If there's anyone listening.
No, I will say, don't make this about the person you are hearing. Make this about you and your community and your environment, and look for opportunities to grow and thrive, right, within that space. Yeah, so thank you.
No, and if there is anyone watching or listening, as Raj said, we have touched some very deep subjects here, but I would really encourage you, if anything that Raj has said during this conversation has resonated with you, share it with someone who might be going through a similar mindset or be in a similar place to what Raj was. So, Raj, thank you, and look forward to talking to you soon. Next time, let's take it more lighthearted.
Sure, we will.
Thank you for joining me. Take care.
You. Appreciate it.
Thank you for joining the Who I Became podcast. To help spread this inspiring story, be sure to share it with your friends, hit the like button, and of course subscribe to our channel so you won't miss out on any future episodes. We'd also love to hear how this story impacted you, so leave a comment on whatever platform you're watching us from. To learn more about this episode, our guests, or Simon, head over to the Simon Osimo /podcast and sign up to receive the latest information delivered straight to your inbox. Once again, thank you for joining us for the Who I Became podcast.